Have you ever wondered who really makes the decisions in crypto? Is it the community, the protocol developers, or the people holding the most tokens? And what if I told you that the future of crypto might be decided not by innovation, but by governance? Hi friends, I'm Lumi Hashley from the Decoding Crypto team. In today's video, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood but important aspects of the crypto world, decentralized governance. It's a big one, and yes, it's a little technical, a little political, and at times controversial. But I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand how DAOs, token voting, and governance power really work. And more importantly, why it matters. Let's begin with the basics. At its core, decentralized governance is about building systems where decision-making power is distributed among the users of a network, rather than centralized in a single entity. This is the world of DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. DAOs are smart, contract-based collectives that use tokens to coordinate and govern. Unlike traditional companies with CEOs and boardrooms, DAOs are run by code and community proposals. Anyone with a governance token can vote, propose, or influence decisions, at least in theory. These governance tokens are the lifeblood of decentralized participation. Hold one, and you're not just a user, you're a decision maker. This idea gave rise to the famous phrase, one token, one vote, crypto's early vision of digital democracy. In its most ideal form, this model empowers every holder, big or small, to influence the direction of a project. Should we update the protocol, allocate treasury funds to a new initiative, launch on a new chain? In theory, it all goes to a vote. Now, let's talk about how these systems actually work. Most DAOs operate using on-chain voting mechanisms where votes are submitted directly through blockchain transactions. Others opt for off-chain voting platforms like Snapshot, where votes are signed but not executed on-chain. To reduce gas costs, proposals typically require a minimum threshold of tokens to be submitted and a quorum for votes to pass. Treasury management is another crucial part. DAOs collectively control vast amounts of capital and decide how to spend it through governance proposals. In some ecosystems, community treasuries can reach tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. This structure was designed to be a revolution. It broke away from traditional corporate hierarchies and put decision-making into the hands of those who actually use the product. It meant ownership wasn't just financial, but also directional. The users weren't just passive consumers anymore. They became stakeholders in every sense. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But as we know, in crypto and in life, theory and practice are not always aligned. Because here's where the cracks begin to show. What happens when the people with the most tokens also have the most power? What if only a small percentage of holders are actually deciding the future of protocols that claim to be governed by everyone? In the next chapter, we're going to look at the hard truth behind this vision. The numbers, the concentration of power, and the uncomfortable reality that many DAOs today look less like democracies and more like plutocracies. Let's dig in. So, we've talked about the dream, the open democratic utopia, where users shape the future of protocols they love. But now, let's step into the real world. And spoiler alert, it's not as romantic as the white papers made it sound. Despite the promise of decentralization, what we see in practice is a much more familiar system, one that eerily mirrors the concentration of power we were supposed to be escaping. Let's start with the numbers. According to Chainalysis, in many DAOs, less than 1% of all holders control over 90% of the voting power. That's right, 1%, 90%. For all the rhetoric around community governance, the actual control often rests with whales, early insiders, or institutions who were first in line during token launches, ICOs, or airdrops. This brings us to a critical point. Initial distribution matters a lot. When tokens are disproportionately allocated to early investors or backers, that power compounds over time. They're not just passive holders, they're active participants, shaping policy, influencing treasury decisions, and ultimately determining the direction of the entire ecosystem. Now let's talk about math, specifically two metrics that reveal how centralized many DAOs actually are. First, the Gini coefficient. Originally used to measure income inequality, it's now being applied to token distribution. And the results? Sky high. Gini scores in the high 0.90s indicate severe imbalance, closer to autocracy than democracy. Then there's the Nakamoto coefficient, a metric that asks a simple question: how many entities would need to collude to take control of a system? In many cases, that number is terrifyingly small. Sometimes, just a handful of addresses can push through or veto any proposal they want. But it's not just about who holds the tokens. It's also about who shows up. Voter participation rates in DAOs are consistently low, often under 10%. The truth is, most people don't vote. Some don't care. Some don't know how. Others feel their vote doesn't matter. And in many ways, they're right. When a single large wallet can outvote thousands of smaller ones, participation feels performative at best. There are also structural barriers. Want to submit a governance proposal? Hope you're ready to spend thousands in gas fees, navigate complex forums, and write code-level specs just to get a seat at the table. This creates a steep barrier to entry, where only the technically savvy or well-funded can meaningfully engage. Governance, then, becomes less about collective will and more about who has the time, resources, and expertise to navigate the system. And so the grand vision of decentralized democracy starts to look a lot more like an oligarchy, a plutocracy in DAO clothing. But what happens when someone flips the system on its head? What if someone uses the rules of governance not just to participate, but to dominate with just a few $1,000s? Well, that's exactly what happened in one of the most high-profile governance exploits to date. In the next chapter, we're heading into the Arbitrum ecosystem to dissect a real-life governance hack that cost only 5 ETH but controlled millions in votes. A great case study. Get ready! This is where theory meets wild reality. All right, contrarians, let's move from theory to practice. You've heard that power in DAO governance is often concentrated. But what if I told you someone spent just 5 ETH, about $10,000 at the time, and used it to sway the direction of an entire blockchain's governance process? This isn't a hypothetical. It actually happened. Let's talk about Arbitrum. The incident revolves around a delegate known as hitmonly.eth who found a clever way to manipulate the system. Using a vote marketplace called Lobbyfi, they spent around 5 ETH to control enough voting power to influence a key committee election within the Arbitrum ecosystem. With that relatively small investment, they gained control over what amounted to $6.5 million worth of delegated votes. So, how did this happen? It all comes down to how vote markets work. Platforms like Lobbyfi allow token holders to essentially rent out their governance rights to others. It's pitched as a way to activate idle voting power, but in practice, it turns governance into a marketplace where the highest bidder can buy political influence. It's democracy with a price tag. And here's the kicker. The price-to-power ratio is shockingly skewed. In this case, $10,000 in ETH gave one actor the ability to steer a major decision. That kind of return on influence is not just impressive, it's destabilizing. You see, DAO governance is supposed to reflect the will of the community, but vote buying flips that idea on its head. Instead of participation being a right tied to ownership, it becomes something you can arbitrage. That undermines trust in the system. It reduces proposals to commodities, and it creates a dangerous precedent. So how did the community react? Well, the response was divided. Some in the Arbitrum community were outraged. To them, this was a betrayal of the core principles of decentralized governance. Others took a more pragmatic stance, arguing that vote markets are inevitable and perhaps even necessary in a world of low participation. The Arbitrum Foundation found itself caught in the middle. On one hand, it didn't want to appear authoritarian by invalidating a democratic vote. On the other, it recognized that such tactics, left unchecked, could erode legitimacy over time. And then there's the legal gray zone. Vote buying at this scale could invite scrutiny from regulators. If DAOs are to be taken seriously as governance entities, they need mechanisms that protect against this kind of exploitation. Otherwise, what's stopping anyone from repeating the same play over and over again? This event was a wake-up call. It showed that even the most robust governance frameworks are vulnerable to economic gamesmanship. It exposed how fragile on-chain democracy can be when incentives are misaligned and markets are left unchecked. So if vote buying isn't the answer, what about big money influence that doesn't even need to buy votes because it already owns them? In the next chapter, we dive into one of the most debated governance battlegrounds in crypto, Uniswap. We'll explore how a handful of venture capital firms, led by Andreessen Horowitz, wield extraordinary influence over the direction of the protocol without ever breaking a rule. Stick around, the rabbit hole goes deeper. Before we dive into the next chapter, let me pause for just a moment. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, make sure to give this video a like so the algorithm knows we're doing something right. And if you want more deep dives into the mechanics of crypto power plays and protocol politics, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're only halfway through, and trust me, the next parts are just getting spicier. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk about Uniswap. Often hailed as one of the most iconic decentralized protocols in the space, Uniswap also sits at the center of one of the most contentious governance debates in all of crypto. And at the heart of it, venture capital, specifically Andreessen Horowitz, one of the most powerful investors in the ecosystem. Publicly, Andreessen Horowitz claims to be a supporter of decentralized governance. But behind the curtain, their control mechanisms are much more sophisticated than a simple token holding. At one point, they controlled over 55 million Uni tokens. That's 5.5% of the entire supply. Now, here's where things get clever. Instead of voting directly from one wallet, they used a delegation strategy. They split their holdings across multiple wallets, each one holding exactly 2.5 million Uni. That's not an arbitrary number. It's the minimum threshold required to submit a proposal to Uniswap governance. By distributing their tokens in this way, Andreessen Horowitz gave themselves the power to initiate multiple proposals without appearing to dominate the process from a single wallet. On the surface, everything looked decentralized. Underneath, they retained directional control. This wasn't just theoretical. When Uniswap had to choose between integrating Wormhole or Layer 0 as its cross-chain messaging provider, Andreessen Horowitz threw its weight behind Layer 0. Critics quickly pointed out that Andreessen Horowitz had a financial stake in Layer 0. And while the vote ultimately passed, it raised serious questions. Was Uniswap governance really about community consensus, or just institutional muscle disguised in fragments? The fee switch debate was another flashpoint. Turning on protocol fees could have generated significant revenue for token holders, but there was pushback. Some believed it would turn Uniswap into a dividend-generating security, drawing regulatory heat. Meanwhile, others argued the real reason was that large holders like Andreessen Horowitz wanted to delay any changes that might shift incentives or invite scrutiny. There were also cross-chain expansion battles, treasury allocation disputes, and a consistent pattern. Those who held the most tokens, often early investors, had the loudest voices in the room. And this is where the venture capital paradox becomes glaring. The very investors who helped get these protocols off the ground are now often the ones steering them, sometimes against the broader interests of the communities they serve. Their goals are not always misaligned, but they are definitely not always aligned either. What's best for token price in the short term may not be what's best for protocol longevity. And when governance becomes concentrated, participation drops, and outcomes start to favor those with capital rather than consensus. In a protocol that's supposed to be governed by its users, is this just the new boardroom in disguise? But if you thought that was bad, wait until you see what happens when governance tokens themselves become the battlefield. When control over liquidity, yield, and protocol integrations becomes a full-on war. Up next, we enter the Curve Wars, where governance isn't just a voting mechanism, it's a weapon. If Uniswap was a battle of influence, then Curve is an all-out war. Curve Finance isn't just another DeFi protocol, it's the backbone of stablecoin liquidity across the Ethereum ecosystem. And in Curve, governance isn't some abstract concept. It's the mechanism that literally determines where billions of dollars in incentives go. That's why holding CRV, and more importantly, locking it as VCRV, became one of the most strategically valuable positions in DeFi. VCRV, or Vote Escrowed CRV, gives token holders governance power and boosted rewards, but only if they lock their CRV for extended periods. The longer the lock, the greater the power. This mechanism turned liquidity incentives into a war chest. Stablecoin protocols like Frax, MIM, and others began competing not with code, but with governance power. The more VCRV they controlled, the more they could direct Curve's emissions toward their own pools, ensuring better yields and attracting more users. Enter Convex Finance. With a clever strategy, Convex offered CRV holders a chance to earn yield without locking their tokens directly. Instead, users deposited CRV into Convex, and Convex handled the locking. In return, Convex accumulated the VCRV, and with it, immense influence. At its peak, Convex controlled over 40% of all VCRV voting power. That is not a governance vote, that is a veto. But it didn't stop there. A bribing economy emerged. Protocols started openly paying VCRV voters to direct liquidity their way. Platforms like Votium made this process seamless. Governance wasn't just gamified, it was commodified. One vote, one paycheck. And the more tokens you had, the higher the bid. This vote for hire ecosystem transformed DeFi into a kind of liquidity cartel. Governance tokens were no longer just about participation. They were tools of competitive advantage. And this gave birth to a new breed of protocols, meta-governance DAOs. These DAOs didn't necessarily build products. They built power. Their whole function was to acquire and direct voting rights across multiple ecosystems. What we saw wasn't decentralization. It was the consolidation of influence wrapped in a DAO badge. And the irony? Many protocols ended up outsourcing governance decisions to these meta-governance DAOs, just to survive in the game. Now, you might be asking, how did we get here? And more importantly, how do we get out? Because while the Curve Wars showed us the brutal elegance of competitive governance, they also exposed how easily decentralization can be hijacked by those who understand the mechanics best. So in our final chapter, we look to the future. We'll explore the most promising ideas being tested, from quadratic voting to delegate systems and multi-chamber governance. We'll also tackle the hard questions. Can DAO governance ever truly be decentralized? Or are we chasing a utopia that was never structurally possible? Let's take a look. So we've seen how DAO governance can be captured, manipulated, even sold to the highest bidder, but what if we could design a better system? Let's begin with the most talked about fix, quadratic voting. Instead of one token equaling one vote, this model makes it increasingly expensive to stack influence. The cost of each additional vote grows exponentially, meaning that while big holders still have power, it becomes costly to dominate decisions. It's an elegant mathematical check on whales, but it has a catch. It requires Sybil resistance. You need to know that each voter is a real, unique person. Which brings us to reputation-based systems. These approaches give voting power not based on token count, but on behavior, reputation, or contribution history. In other words, your influence grows from what you've done, not just what you hold. These systems are still experimental, but they aim to align incentives with merit and long-term trust. Then there's time-weighted voting, where locking tokens for longer increases your influence. It's already in use in systems like Curve, but the idea is evolving. Some protocols are experimenting with dynamic lockups, so voters are rewarded for consistency, not just short-term swings. But technical fixes alone won't save governance. Structure matters too. Take the ENS delegate model. Rather than asking every token holder to vote on every issue, users can delegate to trusted representatives who vote on their behalf. It's transparent, auditable, and has already improved participation dramatically. In a world where most token holders don't vote at all, delegation might be our best shot at meaningful democracy. MakerDAO took it further, undergoing a massive restructuring into what it now calls sub-DAOs, with each focused on specific mandates. It's complex, yes, but it allows specialization, accountability, and clarity, something most DAOs sorely lack. Some are even exploring multi-chamber governance, inspired by bicameral systems in real-world governments. Imagine having one chamber for developers, one for users, and another for token holders. This kind of structural diversity might reduce capture and increase checks and balances. Of course, no discussion about the future is complete without addressing regulation. Governments are watching, and the pressure is mounting. DAOs may soon need to comply with legal frameworks that redefine what decentralization even means. And let's not forget the hardest question. Is full decentralization even possible or desirable? Maybe it's not about building a perfect system, but about building systems that are harder to corrupt, that invite more participation, that shift power away from the few and toward the many. Because the truth is, DAO governance is still an experiment. And like all good experiments, it's messy, full of setbacks, and constantly evolving. But from the Curve Wars to delegate systems, from quadratic voting to vote markets, we've learned one thing: power flows through these systems whether we design for it or not. The challenge is to design better. So as you think about the protocols you support, the tokens you hold, or the votes you skip, ask yourself, are you reinforcing a plutocracy or helping shape a better system? Thanks for watching this deep dive into the mechanics of crypto power. If you found it insightful, hit that like button, share this with your DAO friends, and subscribe so you never miss a chance to decode crypto with clarity. I'm Lumi Hashley from the Decoding Crypto team. And as always, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay decentralized.